first time ever that I'm introducing myself. Wow. I love it. My name is Todd DePastino, and I do history. And I was originally a specialist in late 19th century American social and cultural history. But at heart, I'm really, and I was thinking about this the other day, I'm really a generalist. I mean, when I started teaching, and I was looking through the college catalog of the history courses that I was teaching, I wanted to take every course, and then I wanted to teach every course. That was my secret goal. And so now I get to come here and talk about subjects that especially interest me. And we've been talking about World War I. We've been focusing on World War I since January. And I'm happy to say that the war is finally over. However, the bad news is, now, tonight I want to talk about the peace. And the peace, it can easily be argued, was as catastrophic, or more catastrophic, than the war. Here is a wonderful Winston Churchill quotation. "Those who could win a war well can rarely make a good peace. And those who could make a good peace would never have won the war." I think that's a thoughtful and insightful little sentence, because it does take a different skill set to fight and win a war, and a different mindset to fight and win a war than to make a peace. And I could say categorically, Europe was not in the mindset for peace in 1918 and 1919, and it would have a catastrophic effect on the peace that would unfold. One historian has called it the peace of 1919, the peace to end all peace. And this guy, Ferdinand Foch, a French general, is the most prescient sentence in history. He said, "This isn't a peace, it's an armistice for 20 years. He was off by 65 days. It was 20 years and 65 days after the signing of the Paris Peace Treaty at Versailles. World War II, Hitler invades Poland, and World War II breaks out. Let me give you the story in a nutshell. You've learned it. You learned it probably way back in high school, maybe in college. Maybe you know it. This is just a little thumbnail. Then this is the story I'm going to tell tonight. Is Woodrow Wilson goes to Europe a month after the armistice, full of triumphant idealism, with his plan to put the world back together in a whole new way, under a whole new set of rules and a new global system. Europe ignored him and imposed a punitive peace on Germany, guaranteeing to ruin Germany economically and humiliate Germany. The United States then resorted to isolationism, and you can see it played out in here's some of the cartoons. You know how I like cartoons. Here's a great one of Woodrow Wilson arriving in Paris, hoping that the world will sing a symphony of peace, and he comes to Europe and finds a bunch of crybabies, who won't sing at all. The Allies imposed a punitive peace on Germany that caused Germany just to spiral into chaos and economic ruin. The United States retreated back into isolationism, and a humiliated and seething with anger Germany fuels a rise of what this cartoon calls the Hitler Party, that seeks to exact revenge on the Allies and reverse the Versailles Treaty. Woodrow Wilson dies a broken man as war clouds loom on the horizon for Part 2, the sequel of World War I, which we call World War II. That's the story in a nutshell. Let me dig into some details because they're really fascinating, and it begins with this. With one of the most important speeches in American history, and one of the best speeches in American history, I would say. It's a speech that Woodrow Wilson gave to Congress on January 8th, 1918. It's gone down in history as called the 14 Points speech. And it is certainly not a celebrated speech today. It's never really been celebrated, and it's hardly even talked about. But it's brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. Woodrow Wilson was a great rhetorician. He was a great speech maker. He was a great thinker. He would have done better, I think, in the age of radio. He was 10 years too early to take advantage of his great speech-making ability. And he gave one of the finest and one of the most remarkable speeches, and I mean top 5 in American history. You could make an argument, most important speech of the 20th century. You could make the argument that it is. And I say all this to focus your attention on what Wilson said. And what he said was, this is how the world is going to be put back together after World War I. Mind you, Americans had not fought in the war yet. The war there was still 10 months to go until the end of the war. And here's Woodrow Wilson in January 1918 going before Congress and giving a visionary speech that's also highly detailed about how a new global system will have to come into play and organize relations between nations. He talks very frankly about what nations are going to be wiped off the map. The Ottoman Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. What nations should be created, and what the boundary should be. Poland, and it should have access to the sea. Hungary, Turkey. These are countries that hadn't existed yet, but he is foreshadowing. It would have been a remarkable speech, no matter who gave it. But the fact that an American president gave this speech was unprecedented to the extreme. American presidents never talked about the world. Never. Do you know why? Because they were consumed with this. They didn't have to talk about the world. One of the great benefits of being an American was that 5,000 miles that separated you from Europe. The old joke said, the United States of America was surrounded by a weak country to the north, a weak country to the south, and fish to the east and west. And that gave Americans the luxury to spend the first 130 years of its history focusing on consolidating its continental domain. From sea to shining sea. That's all we did. That's all we talked about from the very first, from the very founding of the nation. From George Washington's farewell address, what does he say? Don't get involved in entangling alliances. Don't make alliances anywhere. Remain aloof and separate from the divisions of Europe. And it was good. Think about this will come into play. This is where history bites you. This comes into play. The Constitution. The Constitution set a ridiculously high bar to ratify any treaty. The President has to sign it, and 2/3 of the Senate have to agree to it. That's a high bar indeed, and that's to discourage any treaties between the U.S. and any other nation. The whole idea is to focus on the United States. That's it. It was not just that the U.S. was ignorant of Europe and didn't want to talk about Europe. It was a matter of principle that American presidents focused entirely on domestic matters. When Woodrow Wilson ran for president in 1912, he didn't once mention international affairs. He made a joke to somebody offhandedly, wouldn't it be something if some kind of international crisis defined my presidency? Wow. Yeah, that's exactly what happened. Now, there had been one president who did talk about international affairs, and it was this guy, President Theodore Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt. TR was a big believer that the era of American isolationism was over and should be, that the U.S. was a great power and should get involved in the great power competition. In other words, Europe, there are 5 great powers, like we talked about in January of Europe. Teddy Roosevelt thought that there should be 6. The United States. The United States would be number 6. We have to get in the game. That's what Roosevelt said. We have to get in the game. There's this great global strategic competition that's been taking place for centuries, and finally, we Americans have graduated our adolescence. We are finally adults, and we can get in the game, and we can get in it to win it with our, with our national interest kind of leading the way. And so the idea was, for Roosevelt, the idea was we got to start acting like a great power. We've got to build up a big navy, got to prepare a big army, got to hire professional diplomats. We got to get in, do all the things you need to do, grab some colonies. Do things you need to do to get in the game. I love this cartoon of TR. Here he is in his Rough Riders outfit, and he's in a hat shop, and he sees a George Washington hat over here and a Lincoln hat over here, and then he sees this big European crown that says imperialism. And he says, I rather like that imported affair. And that was it. He wanted the U.S. to act like a European nation, like a European power. We should call Teddy Roosevelt, and I could picture historians yelling at me for saying this, but I'm going to say it anyhow. I think Roosevelt was the American Bismarck. He was the American Bismarck. He wanted to create the United States of America that was a player in Europe, and also that would play a special role as a broker, much like Bismarck did for European powers. Woodrow Wilson was different. Woodrow Wilson agreed with Teddy Roosevelt that the age of isolationism was over. We're too interconnected. We're too interdependent. The world has shrunk. With new technologies and new ways, methods of travel, the American isolationism is over. It's no longer, the dogmas of old are no longer, what's the Lincoln quote? The dogmas of yesterday? Well, Abraham Lincoln said something like, the dogmas of old are inadequate to the stormy present. I think that's what Lincoln said, which is a wonderful way of phrasing it. And that's exactly what Wilson thought. The dogmas that have guided us here to 1917 got us here for good reason, but now they're no longer adequate for the world. We need a new vision. But, he said, we also shouldn't become like them. Teddy Roosevelt wanted us to leave isolationism and become a great power. Wanted to leave isolationism and play the game. Woodrow Wilson wanted to create a new game. A whole new game with a whole new set of rules. And that game is called Wilsonianism. We don't see references, we don't talk about Wilsonianism much because it was mighty unpopular at the end of World War I, and it was never really revived in name. And this is where I'm going to say something a little bit subtle, but I think important. It's important to separate Wilsonianism, the vision, from Woodrow Wilson, the man. Woodrow Wilson dies. Wilsonianism lives on in new names and in new disguises. Wilsonianism is with us still, very much. And it was all born from that remarkable speech on January 8th, 1918. Here are some of the tenets of Wilsonianism, and we may not think are remarkable because we're so used to them. Number one, freedom of trade. This is unusual. Tear down tariffs, tear down the barriers that inhibit trade worldwide. There should be no or very low tariff barriers, and there should be freedom of trade with every nation should be allowed to trade with every other nation. Freedom of seas. The seas should be an international freeway. There should be, which it was not. It had never been. No country should be allowed to stop any other country's ships from trading with somebody else. No more boarding American ships, taking the cargo, turning us around, sending them back. No more of that. Freedom of seas. Arms reduction. We have too many powerful weapons in the world. It's too dangerous. Let's have an agreement to bring down the size of our armies and the terrible weapons that we all have. Number 4, some of these principles are vague. Self-determination. This is vague. What does that mean? Self-determination. It means every peoples of the earth. Well, there are different ways to interpret it. Let me give you the broad interpretation. Every peoples of the earth have the right to determine their own form of government. Wow! People didn't normally say that. What does that mean? Are you talking all people? Africans? If you are talking Africans, then maybe there should be a Namibia for Namibians. Maybe there should be no colonies anywhere. Maybe the peoples of the earth can be free to and independent to form their own nations. There is that message absolutely embedded in Wilsonianism. Now, Wilson didn't take it that far. This is where you have to separate Wilsonianism from Wilson. Wilson had a more narrow vision of what self-determination was, and that was like, generally, if it's practical, the peoples of Europe should be able to determine their own destiny. So break up the European internal empires like the Ottoman Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. But there's a more radical critique, I think, a kind of anti-imperialism embedded in Wilsonianism. Open agreements. This is something that may seem unimportant, but boy was it important, because in other words, he's saying countries should no longer have secret agreements with each other that you don't know about. Because then you could walk into an ambush. You could walk it. It happened all the time. Country A would make an agreement with country B, and then on the side make an agreement with country C to fight against country B. This happened all the time. For example, in 1916 or 1915, the British pledged publicly to support a pan-Arab state in the Middle East. And they sent a bunch of British advisors to go and assist Emir Faisal, the Hashemite heir to the Hashemite throne in the Middle East, to make war, revolt against the Ottoman Empire, the Arab revolt, to create a pan-Arab state from Palestine all the way through to Iraq. That was the pledge. And it was the famous Lawrence of Arabia, T.E. Lawrence, was the advisor that helped Faisal in this Arab revolt. Meanwhile, however, unknown to T.E. Lawrence, the British had also made an agreement with France not to allow a pan-Arab state. The Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916 split the Middle East down the middle, giving the French Syria and Lebanon and giving the British Palestine and Iraq. That was the secret agreement that held precedence over the public agreement. So these secret agreements are deadly. They should be open so everybody knows where everybody else stands. And then finally, the principle of collective security. I was thinking about how to explain this one. Okay, here's a good analogy. Let's say I go to Rose's house and I break in when she's not there. And I steal all her Serbian antiques that she has everywhere, right? And I go to sell them on a market to make some money. Rose learns that I'm the one who broke it. What does Rose do if she knows that I'm the one who broke it and stole that? Does Rose go grab her Serbian pistol and drive to my house and knock on the door and then shoot me and take back the... No! She reports me to the police. She gives up her sovereignty, her right to to make her grievance right. She gives up her sovereignty actually to the state of Pennsylvania. So I get arrested, I get put on trial, and the case is known as DePastino versus the state of Pennsylvania. It's not DePastino versus Gantner. You know what I mean? She's out of it. She's just a party to it. She has handed the case over. And this is kind of what the principle of collective security means on a global scale. So that if your country is offended or damaged or hurt by another country, you have a place to go, a League of Nations, a United Nations to go to right the wrong. You have a place to go to report your grievance, rather than just, striking out on your own and throwing the world into turmoil. These are, if you were to ask 10 historians, what are the, name some principles of Wilsonianism, you're going to get 10 different lists. But these, to me, are the most important elements of Wilsonianism. Now, this is where, look, okay, this is where I'm going to change the slide. Your job is to stay awake. I almost took the slide out because I was afraid people would fall asleep. Because nobody ever, if you ever read about or hear a lecture about the 14 points in the Treaty of Versailles, every lecturer, and I almost said this, will say, well, I'm not going to recite all 14 points, because who the hell wants to look at all 14 points? But I am going to go through them quickly, just so you have an idea of what the 14 points are. And they were all written up on one sheet, and they were put into artillery shells, and they were lobbed over no man's land into the German territory on the German side in 1918, so that the Germans would read them and understand, if we surrender, if we sue for peace, we will be treated fairly. We will look forward to a new world. We won't be punished. This was the hope of the 14 points, that it would encourage the Germans to end the war, to surrender. Here they are, in order. Open diplomacy without secret treaties. Number 2, freedom of seas. Number 3, free trade. Number 4, international disarmament or arms reductions. Number 5, adjustment of colonial claims. That's vague. What does that mean? Does that mean Namibia gets to be independent, or does it mean that Britain and Germany get to split Namibia? Number 6, Germany must evacuate Russia. 7, Germany must evacuate Belgium. They've been occupying Belgium since August 1914. Number 8, Germany must evacuate France and restore Alsace-Lorraine to France. Number 9, Italy should gain parts of Austro-Hungary, where the Italians are. The Italian parts. That's a really key idea to Wilsonianism, is you can't have these gigantic empires where all these different ethnic groups are thrown into. If you have, in the Russian Empire, if you have a large group of people who speak Lithuanian, they should get a country called Lithuania. Latvia for Latvians, Estonia for Estonians, that kind of thing. You don't just throw them all into one empire. Ethnic groups of Austro-Hungary should enjoy autonomous development. Now, how far do we take this? If you have 50,000 of a language group, do they get their own nation? That seems too small. Probably not. But maybe they should have their own province within a nation, or state within a nation. Some kind of autonomous development that will give those people a sense of self-determination. Number 11, Austro-Hungary must evacuate the Balkans, and the borders of Balkan states must be redrawn. Number 12, the Ottoman Empire must dissolve. Wow. Turkey should be created. Wilson said this long before. Turkey isn't created until 5 years later. But Wilson saw this as something that should happen. Other Ottoman ethnic groups should enjoy autonomous development. This is the Turks liked this part. The Turks did not like this part. Turkish Straits to the Black Sea must be open to all. They say, hey, wait a minute, our capital is in the Turkish Straits. It can't be internationalized. And number 13, independent Poland should be created with access to the sea. And 14, the creation, and the most important from the Wilson point of view, the creation of the League of Nations to guarantee collective security for the world. And you are all awake, and I'm so happy. This was the plan that Woodrow Wilson brought to Europe in December 1918, 1 month after the signing of the armistice on November 11th. 1 month. Woodrow Wilson goes to Europe and stays for 6 months. It's the first time an American president had ever left the country. had ever visited Europe. And it wasn't because American presidents didn't refuse to go to Europe, because of transportation. They refused to go to Europe because it was not their place. Their place was at home. They would have gotten criticized if they left the United States. And Wilson got criticized. His advisors said, "You're out of your mind to go to Europe. What are you gonna? You're gonna leave and not come back and not get involved in domestic politics at all for 6 months? Not only that, but what are you gonna do in Europe?" And he said, "I'm going to negotiate the peace." And they said, "You're going to get eaten alive." Those European negotiators, those European diplomats have been doing this for centuries. They will cut your throat and you'll be lying dead before you even realize you've been cut. This is just like they will just run circles around you. If we're going to be deeply involved in these negotiations, we should send professional diplomats over. And he said no. He wanted to stake his own prestige, the prestige of his office, and the prestige of the United States of America on the success of Wilsonianism, on the success of the 14 points. He put it all out there. And when Wilson arrived, man, was it a celebration. It was the biggest crowd, and I have read, and I don't know if this is true, but I've read that the crowds that came out to see Woodrow Wilson were only surpassed once in history. And that was in 2018 when France won the World Cup. And the team came back and there were a big parade. But millions of French people came out to cheer Wilson as a kind of a symbol of the end of the war, a symbol of the end of the nightmare of World War I, and a symbol perhaps of a new world. But the new world to come. But the cheers and the celebration and the praise that Wilson got hid a much deeper, darker mood in France and among the other allies. Here are the big four, as they were called. Woodrow Wilson on the right, Georges Clemenceau, the French Prime Minister, right here, Vittorio Orlando, the Italian Prime Minister, right here, and David Lloyd George, the British Prime Minister, on the far left. These were the four men, especially if you minus Orlando, the three men who together made the Treaty of Versailles. And Georges Clemenceau, it is not an exaggeration to say, hated Woodrow Wilson from the moment he saw him. Hated the 14 points, hated the fact that an American president had anything to do with settling the peace of the Great War. Clemenceau said, "Mr. Wilson bores me with his 14 points. Why, God Almighty only has 10. That was his view of it. And from within the first hour that he met Wilson, he reminded Wilson, "You and your country have never been involved in European affairs. This is your first time over this side of the ocean. What gives you the right to tell us how we're going to treat a vanquished and hated foe? What gives you the right? We've been fighting this war for 4 years. You've been fighting the war for 4 months." Here he would remind him, he would pull out. He had colorful charts showing, this chart is the World War I military deaths. Clemenceau always said 24% of all military deaths in this war were French. 24%. 20% were British, 32% were Russian, 11% were Italian, 5%, tiny Serbia contributed 5% of all the military deaths in World War I, 5% Romania, and then the United States, 2%. Tiny. Another chart. Here are World War I casualties. Germany here on the far left with 1.8 million casualties. The United States here with the lowest number, 115,000. The mood in Europe was, how dare you? Clemenceau and a lot of French people thought Wilson was arrogant, grandiloquent, declamatory. I mean, every word that you could imagine. Like, how dare this guy come over here and tell us what to do when he hasn't suffered what we've suffered? Here he is trying to lead Europe in song, a song of everlasting peace, and all the powers here have these pistols in their pockets, just getting ready for the moment to settle these scores their way, the way that they have before. And George Clemenceau had his own plan for peace. And it wasn't 14 points, it was 4 points. And it began with this: hang the Kaiser, hang Ludendorff, hang Hindenburg, hang all the German military leaders who have contributed to this catastrophe for not only France, but for Belgium, for Britain, for Italy, for look what's happened in the East with the Russian Empire. Hang them all. Number 2, dissolve Germany. Germany is new. It was only created out of about 100 different little principalities in 1871. They've been nothing but a menace since. They've contributed nothing. All they do is roil the continent in turmoil. Let's break Germany down to its original constituent parts again so it could never rear up and threaten the peace of Europe ever again. Number 3, make Germany pay. Make the German people pay for the damage that they did, which was extensive, to Belgium and France especially. If it means that the French people will suffer, so be it, because they inflicted horrible suffering on Europe. And number 4, no League of Nations. We will settle our own disputes, thank you very much. This war has taught us, said the French, not that we need to turn to collective security, but we need to be better prepared for the next time a foe like Germany should attempt to take over the continent. We will defend ourselves, thank you very much. Here's a cartoon. There's Clemenceau there. At the peace table, he's welcoming the German delegation to the peace table, and you can see their chairs are spiked. The cake is spiked. He's got handcuffs and other instruments of malfeasance on the table. Clemenceau's nickname was the Tiger, and this is his face on a tiger kind of catching the German imperial eagle right there. If it had been just Wilson and Clemenceau, the Paris talks would have lasted not even a week. They just could not even begin to have a conversation. The only reason we had a Paris peace treaty, a Versailles treaty, the only reason was because of this man, David Lloyd George. David Lloyd George was Welsh. That made him. Do we have any Welsh people here? Boy, when you read about David Lloyd George at the time, I clearly don't know enough about British history. But when you're reading about David Lloyd George by British sources at the time, they mention every other sentence that he's Welsh. And I can't quite figure out what that means. But what he was a politician. I mean, a real politician. Spoke out of both sides of his mouth. He privately believed that Wilson's plan was great. He publicly said that he agreed with Clemenceau. And so his role was really to keep the talks going. He acted as a broker between Clemenceau and Wilson, and because of David Lloyd George, after many, many months, and the negotiations went on from January through May. The intense months were March, April, and May, the first half of May. It was David Lloyd George who really kept the negotiations moving. And while the Paris peace talks were going on, these were very public. The conversations, the debates were all in the newspapers. And everybody realized, because of the 14 points, everything was up for grabs. The world was really going to be made over. And so if you had a cause to advocate for, if you had your own piece of real estate that you wanted, you sent a representative to Paris to try and get it. And man, did they come. The great historian Margaret, she's so great I forgot her name. Her father was her grandfather was a prime minister. Margaret Macmillan has called Margaret Macmillan has called the Paris Peace Talks of 1918-1919 the Grand Bazaar, where people from all over the world came in these exotic dress often, kind of seeking, independence, their nation's independence, or at least an improvement of their national position. Queen Mary of Romania came and flirted very publicly with Woodrow Wilson, and he had a thing for her. And she asked him politely for Transylvania, and she got it. The Ukrainian delegation came. They asked for an independence from the Russian Empire, and they didn't get it. Neither did Emir Faisal. There he is. I was just talking about him. He was the Arab leader, the Hashemite leader, the 32nd descendant of Muhammad, a rival of the Saud family, the Saudi Arabia. He had a vision of creating a pan-Arab state all the way from Palestine through Iraq. And he would eventually become the first king of Syria. That kicked him out of there. He became the first king of Iraq. And there is his advisor and friend, Lawrence of Arabia. Emir Faisal came seeking a pan-Arab nation in the Middle East, and he didn't get it. How about this guy? I've shown his picture before. Some of you will recognize him. That is a very young Ho Chi Minh. His name was Nguyen Ai Quoc back then, and he came wanting the independence of his country, Vietnam, from colonial oppression in France, and he didn't get it. But this was the kind of thing that attracted people from all over the world who were, seeking their little piece of this new global order. The one group that was not welcome in Paris were the Germans. The Germans were kept out. They were not participants in the Paris negotiations. They were told to hold tight in Germany and await word from the Big Four about what the peace terms would be, and the Germans would have a week or two to decide whether to sign or not. If they signed, the treaty would be effective immediately. If they didn't sign, the war would start over again. And France would invade Germany. That was it. When the Germans first got a hint of what the Versailles Treaty contained, there was a mass protest. This is the first day of weeks of protest in Germany on May 15th, 1919. Let me tell you, Germany was this was a crazy time in Germany in 1919. The German people couldn't agree on anything. You had conservative monarchists over here, you had radical communists over here, and you had everything in between. All they did was fight with each other. There's one thing that the German people agreed on, and that was this was a lousy treaty. That was the one thing. They had a common enemy. That was the treaty that was being imposed on them. They were given, again, just a week or two to review the terms. And then a delegation was invited, and there was all kinds of negotiations over who's going to be the unlucky ones who are going to be sent to Paris to have to sign this thing. Eventually, several Germans do go. They come in, they arrive, I think 24 hours before the signing in Versailles, in the Hall of Mirrors, in Versailles Palace. And I think it was 90 minutes before the ceremony began, they finally decided that they are going to sign it. The signing ceremony was held, it's called the Versailles Treaty, because the treaty was signed at Versailles. It wasn't negotiated there. It was only signed there at King Louis XIV's palace in the Hall of Mirrors. And the reason the Hall of Mirrors was chosen, it was the biggest room that we could squeeze in 1,000 people. And it was signed on June 28, 1919, 5 years to the day after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo. 5 years to the day. He was assassinated on June 28th, 1914. So what did this treaty do to Germany? It wasn't good. Number one, Germany had to give up all its colonies. They were divided among the French, the British, and the Japanese. Germany had to surrender 13% of its land. That does not sound like much to me. But when you look at what land it was the most valuable land. 50% of the industry, 50% of the coal. You know, the great German economic might was now torn from them. Germany had to cede territory to the new Lithuania, to the new Poland, to Denmark over here, to the new Czechoslovakia, to France, had to give up Alsace-Lorraine, a little bit to Belgium, right here, and then had to give up also this big, valuable part near the Ruhr and the Rhine River, Western Germany, where the heart of the German industrial heartland was. That all was internationalized and kind of put under international observation. Its military was eroded to almost nothing. Its army reduced to 100,000 men, no tanks, no air force at all, no military at all allowed west of this yellow line. Hardly any navy. The navy was going to be limited to 6 ships, no submarines. And then the worst of it was the reparations. Reparations. The treaty said that the Germans had to pay for all the damage that was done during World War I. How do you calculate the damage that's done in World War I? I mean, there's no scale that's large enough to calculate the damage. And actually, the negotiator said that they didn't know how much damage was. So the terms were Germany would sign a blank check, as it were, promising to repay whatever amount the Allies said they had to repay, and it would begin with $5 billion in gold. The estimate, the best estimate economists would give, and the Allies were not held to this number, was $55 billion in reparations, which was guaranteed to humiliate Germany and impoverish Germany for generations. Here's a cartoon of Germany kind of under the weight of this bag of reparations, $55 billion. And Germany says, let's see you collect it. This was a bitter pill for Germany to swallow, but swallow it they did, rather than see the resumption of war. And it was a bitter pill also for Woodrow Wilson. This was not the 14 points. This was not Wilsonianism. This was not the vision that Woodrow Wilson had. And so why did he agree to it? Why did he agree to the Versailles Treaty with all of these harsh, punitive, Carthaginian terms imposed on Germany? And the reason is because the Treaty of Versailles included the one thing that mattered most to Wilson, and that was the League of Nations. That was the 14th point. Collective security. Clemenceau agreed reluctantly to a League of Nations, which would have an executive council of 5 nations. The United States would be one of them, and that would be a mediary. It would adjudicate conflicts among nations and hopefully prevent a resumption of war. Woodrow Wilson came back to the United States with the Treaty of Versailles in hand. In July 1919. Here's a wonderful cartoon. I like this so much. Here's Woodrow Wilson returning home with his young lady, the League of Nations. And the caption is, bringing her home to show the folks. Like to introduce Americans to this strange thing that came out of Wilson's brain and that he managed to get into the Treaty of Versailles, kind of educate Americans about the League of Nations. And you could see Congress is looking skeptical. Uncle Sam here, he looks like he likes what he sees. The GOP looks a little grouchy about it, but she's not protesting too much. And the public is looks fairly happy. And I think this is a fair representation of what Americans thought about the League of Nations and the Treaty of Versailles in July 1919. There's a myth, and it is a myth, that we were a depressed, disillusioned, down in the dumps culture in 1919 because of the end of World War I. And that's not really true. We would get down in the dumps. There would be disillusionment, but it would come later. In 1919, Americans they liked the League of Nations. They liked the Versailles Treaty. They supported President Wilson. There were Americans who were against it, absolutely. German Americans didn't like it. Irish Americans didn't like it because the English liked it. Midwestern farmers were isolationists by tradition, so they didn't like it. There was a wing of the Republican Party that were isolationists, but only a wing, not a majority of the Republican Party. Most Americans would have voted for the League of Nations and the Versailles Treaty. But, as I mentioned before, most Americans didn't have a say, did they? A treaty must be ratified by 2/3 of the U.S. Senate. That's all that matters. That's all that matters. And even then, Wilson was in a good position. The Democratic Party had lost control of the Senate in the November elections. So it was a very slim Republican majority. But Wilson was guaranteed every Democratic vote. And he was guaranteed more than half of the Republican vote. He was going to kind of sail this through fairly easily. Republicans were going to spar with him on this. That was clear. There were the isolationists who were never going to vote for it. But most Republican senators were what were called reservationists. They had reservations about the treaty. Does this League of Nations mean that if, Romania and Bulgaria go to war with each other, that we have to send troops to separate? That doesn't make sense. They wanted clarification. They had reservations. How much sovereignty are we giving up by joining the League of Nations? This had to be worked out, and Republicans wanted to be public about they're having a say. If this is going to be our new treaty, the new way, the new global system, the Republicans wanted a say in how it was formed. So there was going to be some arguing, there was going to be some sparring, there was going to be some tweaking, there was going to be some revisions, there was going to be some adjusting of the Treaty of Versailles. And it was at this point that one of the most baffling episodes in American political history started to happen. Woodrow Wilson, out of nowhere, announced, there will be no discussion, there will be no debate, there will be no negotiations, there will be no revisions, no tweaking, no adjustments, no nothing. This treaty I am presenting you has to be accepted or denied as it is. I will not negotiate this. This was a strange way to deal with this political situation, and the Republican leader in the Senate, the majority leader in the Senate, Henry Cabot Lodge, a conservative Republican from Massachusetts, it's like he smelled blood. Lodge hated Wilson. Wilson hated Lodge. They were probably the two most arrogant men in American politics at the time. One was a Harvard man, one was a Princeton man. They hated each other entirely. And Lodge knew this. Lodge could sense that something was off with Wilson. He could sense, oh boy, okay, I have a younger brother, 3 years younger than me. I see him once or twice a year. He lives in Montana. I just have been talking to him. I'm going to go out and visit him. And when I see him, within an hour, I'm going to tease him about something. And I can't help it. if he's sitting there and looking happy and content, I gotta do something to him, you know. I gotta get him to punch me, and that's the way we are, and that's how I picture kind of Wilson and Lodge. That Lodge sensed that Wilson was being prickly about something, and so he poked it and poked him and poked him. For example, Lodge was the Senate leader, but he was also the chair of the Foreign Relations Committee. And so Lodge said, we've got to get to know this treaty. It's 400 pages long. I'm going to read it aloud on the Senate floor. And he did. Lodge announced that he had 50 reservations about the treaty, and he would announce one per day, and then ask the president to respond. Every time Lodge proposed his reservation, Woodrow Wilson came out just guns blazing, Woodrow Wilson created a debate where there had been no debate. And Lodge stretched it out for as long as he could. He had dozens of people come onto the Senate subcommittee to testify about their thoughts about the treaty, including drunks that he picked up off the street, to bring in. What do you think about this treaty? He made sure that this treaty was so criticized, so beaten up, and here's another cartoon. Here's Lodge with the peace treaty, the Treaty of Versailles, all beaten up coming out of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Just absolutely kind of, creating a lot of public doubt about the treaty. Wilson responded with high contempt for anybody who had any criticism of the treaty. Woodrow Wilson was a very devout Presbyterian. His father had been a Presbyterian minister. And his biographers would say Wilson became very Presbyterian in the summer of 1919, meaning that very rigid, very holier than thou. He did believe, he came to believe that he was an instrument of God. And he, in fact, at one point said, this treaty cannot be revised because it wasn't written in the hand of man, it was written in the hand of God. Kind of, just very rigid. And with Wilson's kind of rigid refusal to negotiate any of the terms, even if they're fig leaf, refuse to put on any kind of fig leaf or cover, allow the Republicans to have any kind of cover in the passing of this ratification of this treaty, the treaty went down for defeat. In 1919, 2 versions of the treaty were put to the vote. The first version had 5 revisions, that's all. And they weren't great. They weren't big ones. Wilson ordered that all Democrats not vote for it. Then the original treaty was introduced. Lodge ordered that all Republicans not vote for it. It went down in defeat. It missed the 2/3 majority by 7 votes. Here's a cartoon. Humanity accusing the U.S. Senate of killing the Treaty of Peace. This is devastating. We don't know what would have happened if the treaty had been ratified, if the U.S. had been a party to the League of Nations. Might it have prevented the Great Depression, or from making the Great Depression as bad as it was? Might it have helped stem the rise of fascism in Europe? Might it have prevented World War II? We don't know. There is speculation, good cause for speculation, that it would have. But because the United States never ratified the treaty and never joined the League of Nations, history unfolded the way it did. And Woodrow Wilson has gone down in history as being the president who snatched defeat from the jaws of victory. You know what I mean? He had it. He had the League of Nations. He had the Versailles Treaty. He came home, got into a petty dispute, and lost it. How did he do it? How did he fumble it? You probably learned in your history books or in college and high school that he lost it because Woodrow Wilson had a PhD. He's our only president with a PhD. A pointy-headed intellectual. He was too idealistic. He was too intellectual. He didn't know how to get down and dirty in the rough and tumble world of American politics. He was blowing bubbles of idealism out of bubbles of the League of Nations out of his bowl of idealism. He was giving this heavy League of Nations to this dove of peace that couldn't handle it. He was sending the rabbit of the League of Nations into a world filled with vipers. In other words, that Woodrow Wilson was the wrong man for this moment. Woodrow Wilson was too idealistic for a rough and tumble world. And I don't buy that argument, because Woodrow Wilson was a politician. He is our only PhD who became president, but he was a politician, and a great one. Really good. I mean, this guy almost single-handedly resurrected the Democratic Party from the shadow of the Confederacy, from the oblivion of the Confederacy. He dragged the Democratic Party into the 20th century. He became president in 1912 with a very ambitious domestic agenda, and he achieved every one of his goals. Every one. His agenda was as ambitious, almost, as FDR's or Lyndon Johnson's. The first 8-hour day bill, the first child labor law. He created the Security Exchange Commission, Federal Trade Commission. He created the Federal Reserve, the first income tax. It was a very ambitious agenda, and he got it done. There's no way he could have achieved those legislative victories without a great deal of understanding the practical game of politics. I think the problem with Woodrow Wilson was that he was sick. He had gotten sick, very sick. He had a major stroke in March of 1919. It has not been confirmed for sure that that's what he had, because he also had the flu at the same time. It appears that he might have had the stroke while he had the flu. He was in bed for 2 weeks in Paris in March. And in retrospect, the people around him said, the man who emerged from that bed was not the same man who went in it. That after his recovery, he had changed. Something had happened. He was irritable. He was rigid. He was paranoid. He fired all his servants and maids because he said they were stealing from him. He accused waiters of spying as being German spies or French spies. He wrote his own memos. He wouldn't trust anybody to dash off a memo for him because he didn't trust them, because he thought they were playing on another side. He kept his own counsel. He got into disputes he broke a lot of old friendships, including with this guy, Colonel House, who was his most trusted and closest advisor. I think at one point Edward House said to Wilson in August or September 1919, hey, some of these 5 reservations are not really that big a deal. We could kind of soften them and get the treaty ratified. Wilson never spoke to him again. Called him a traitor, never spoke to him again. This was odd. This was very odd behavior. Wilson himself, it turns out, and there's a good book about his health. He had health problems from childhood, neurological problems. He probably suffered from strokes as a child. He would have periods where he went blind in one eye for months, where he would lose feeling. He wouldn't be able to use his hand for months. He's 12 years old. He had neurological problems. He was a brilliant student, absolutely always brilliant student, but he didn't learn to read until he was 12. And when he did read, he never was a fast reader. He was a slow reader who would memorize every page he read. And I'm just saying all this because there are hints of some kind of neurological problem here. He could not. He had dysgraphia. He could not write well. He could not write, but he could do shorthand and he could type. He was a writer, and he couldn't write. He wrote as well with his left hand as he did his right hand. All kinds of strange neurological problems that he had, and they all seemed to culminate in 1919 with this stroke. He went on a barn-burning tour, whistle-stop tour of the country, all the way from Washington, D.C. to the Pacific Northwest, down to California, to Colorado, giving speeches, 4 speeches a day, 7 days a week for 3 weeks. It was exhausting. 6 days after this photo was taken, this is Wilson in Los Angeles, Wilson gave a speech in Pueblo, Colorado, went back to his compartment and collapsed. He had a massive stroke. The train took him back to Washington, D.C. He got back to Washington, and almost as soon as he entered the White House, he had a second, far more devastating stroke. It almost killed him. It should have killed him. Maybe if he had been any other man, it would have killed him, but it didn't. But it left him paralyzed. I mean, he couldn't speak. He couldn't move. He didn't leave his bedroom for 4 weeks. He didn't leave bed for 4 weeks. I don't think he left his bedroom for a year. He didn't leave the White House for 18 months. We had a president who was incapacitated. And it was entirely hidden from the public. This was a scandal. His wife hid the news from everybody. He had a young wife, his second wife. They got married in the White House, Edith. Edith Wilson. She ran the country in his name for 18 months. And very few people knew that. One Senator, Albert Fall from New Mexico, did some spying in the White House to see exactly how sick Wilson was. And he said, the presidentress who had fulfilled the dream of suffragettes by changing her title from First Lady to Acting First Man. She staged this photo. She propped Wilson up to make him look like he could work at a desk. And this is a photo that you often see in textbooks of Wilson as president, but it was entirely staged. So it goes. It goes unsaid that Wilson just simply was not a part of any kind of. He was not mentally capable, physically capable of being part of any negotiation of the Treaty of Versailles. So Wilson, and he would die in 1924. He would linger until 1924. He would go out of office, and this man became president in the election of 1920. This is one of the lowlights of our American presidential history. He was a real nobody from Ohio, and he ran on just that he wasn't Wilson. He ran against the repudiation of everything Wilsonian. He said he would return the country to normalcy, and Warren G. Harding was elected by a large margin, and kind of brought the country back to isolationism during the Roaring '20s. Meanwhile, in Germany, things spun out of control. Disaster unfolded in Germany, emblemized best by the infamous hyperinflation of the Weimar Republic. This loaf of bread in 1921 cost 163 marks. In 1922, it cost 1.5 million marks. In 1923, this cost 200 billion marks. That kind of hyperinflation. And because of that, maybe you remember seeing pictures of like this woman feeding her furnace with marks, a man buying marks by weight, not by denomination, boys making a kite out of marks. This woman has a dress made out of marks. And part of the inflation, a large part of the inflation, was deliberate. The Weimar Republic inflated the currency because the reparations were so high. If you want our marks, you got them, buddy. Here's a bunch of worthless money. Eventually, in 1923, Germany announced that they would not repay anything anymore. And so France invaded Germany, Western Germany, in a very little remembered military operation. In 1923, France invaded Western Germany and took everything that wasn't nailed down. And a lot of stuff that was nailed down. Roof tiles, railroad cars. Factories were dismantled and shipped back to France. I mean, this was a great humiliation for the German people. They remembered it vividly, although the West tended to forget it. And this sense of seething anger, rage and resentment against the Treaty of Versailles, against the dastardly allies that committed this humiliation and this ruin on Germany. And remember, Germany surrendered without ever an ally stepping foot in Germany. To the Germans, they had won the war. They ended the war occupying Belgium, occupying parts of France, occupying a third of the Russian Empire. They should have been the winners. Instead, they were humiliated. And here's the soldier on the right, Bavarian corporal. There followed, and this is after November 11th, there followed terrible days and even worse nights. I knew that all was lost. In these nights, hatred grew in me, hatred for those responsible for this deed. This soldier would stay in the army. He would be given a job as in the German army in intelligence. He was an intelligence enlisted man. And he was given the job to spy on this tiny party, political party with maybe 59 members called the German Workers' Party. He was to spy on them in their meetings and report back to the army about what this party was doing. And he did. He reported back. But then he would go to every meeting and he would agree with the speakers. And so he decided to run for office in the party. Then he became the head of the party. He went from spying on the party to joining the party. And of course, that man and the party would become the National Socialist Party of Germany, Nazi Party. And that man was Adolf Hitler. And it was Hitler's ability to tap into the rage and resentment that all Germans felt toward this treaty that helped propel him and his movement to power and put Germany and the world on the path to a resurrection or a refreshment of the war that we know of as World War II. How much does the Treaty of Versailles hold in blame for World War II? I think quite a bit. I was trying to figure out a way to explain just what was wrong with the Treaty of Versailles. Was it too lenient? Was it too harsh? And the problem was, it was right in the middle. It wasn't enough of either. It was the un-Goldilocks, right? The Goldilocks story. This bed is too soft, this bed is too hard, and this bed is just right. The Treaty of Versailles was just wrong. It was punitive enough to guarantee that the German people would want to resume war, but it was lenient enough to allow Germany to continue to exist. No nation could have existed under the terms. If you're going to impose that terms, you would have to dissolve the nation. But the Versailles Treaty just had it wrong. And because of that, Woodrow Wilson has gone down in history as one of our worst presidents. The verdict on Wilson is not good. And it's hard to argue with it. I mean, here's a guy who, entered office, who led the country into an unpopular war, who fumbled the peace badly, and who left the world worse than when he entered office. How do you make the argument that he isn't terrible? And you'll see, especially in the past couple decades, Wilson has had the label of one of the worst presidents ever. But this is where I want to remind you that of the importance of separating, and I see how late it is. God darn it, Todd. All you do is gab, gab, gab. But I promise this is it. This is the end. Wilson, this is the importance of separating Wilson the man from Wilsonianism. Wilson the man died a disappointed man. But Wilsonianism lived on. It continued and continues to this day to inspire a great number of American political leaders. And it absolutely was the bedrock inspiration of this man who had served as Assistant Secretary of the Navy under Wilson, who loved the 14 points, loved the principles of self-determination and collective security, never ever mentioned Wilson's name because he knew how unpopular Wilson was, but he adopted all of Wilson's principles. And he formulated them in new ways, he gave them a new vision, and I think it's because of that Wilsonianism how it got expressed after World War II, that the world has been able to keep an unsteady peace since World War II. In other words, Woodrow Wilson Wilsonianism was not able to prevent the outbreak of World War II, but it might have prevented the outbreak of World War III. The United Nations, another name for the League of Nations. The Marshall Plan, another expression of Wilsonianism in terms of free trade. NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, collective security. SEATO, the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization. The World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the World Trade Organizations. All of these, I think, are expressions of Wilsonianism, and these have been some of the institutions that have kept this unsteady peace and prevented World War III from breaking out after the end of the surrender of Nazi Germany in 1945. Thank you. Now, you would think, okay, I just want to let you know, next month I'm going to be here, and you would think I'd want to move on from World War I. No such luck, Bill. I'm going to, here's what I'd like to do. In talking with Bill and in talking with others, I know that there are several of you here who have family members who served in World War I. Fathers, uncles, maybe grandparents, and you have some family stories about World War I. Next month, I would like to invite you to share some of these stories. I'll go around the room and I'd just, tell us what you know. Tell us what your connection to this war is. And that will also give me the opportunity to tie up a few loose ends that I do want to tie up. Tell a few very little stories, not the big grand story that I told today, but a few little anecdotes that I want to share before we move on to another subject. So I'll see you next month.
Thank you.